Open the podcast bay door as hell.
Hello everyone, and welcome to episode 16 of Welcome to Geektown. I'm your host, Kurt Onstead. I've been a proud geek all my life, being into role-playing games, board games, sci-fi, fantasy, and especially superheroes and comics. And I want to help others join me in those pursuits. But I've found that sometimes people can get overwhelmed or feel left out because they don't already have what some consider the requisite knowledge to be considered a fan. And that's where Welcome to Geektown comes in. Here, you can ask your questions without feeling like a gatekeeper is calling you out for not yet being fully versed in every aspect of your new interest. A quick little note. I've mentioned Radio Public as an app that you can use to help support the show directly. I do get a little money from each listen you give through that free app, which helps offset the costs of web hosting, domain costs, and other charges associated with running a podcast. Now, if you want to actually send me some money directly, you can do so in the app. Radio Public has added a tip button, so you can send $1 or $2 to your favorite podcasts with just a quick click. It's a great way to say thank you to those who spend their free time working to entertain and educate you. But even if you never tip, I do want to say thank you to all of you who listen regularly. I appreciate you all. Okay, on to the show. Now, I've mentioned role-playing games in the intro since episode 1, but we haven't yet had any questions about that topic. Until now. Reddit user WIDK Producer wants to know, do you think metagaming/min-maxing enhances or ruins a gaming experience? That's a good question. The simple answer is, all things in moderation. But let's look at both of those terms individually and give a few examples before we get into the longer version of the answer, so that everyone is familiar with what we're talking about. If you're completely unfamiliar, let me just briefly describe role-playing games, or RPGs. Dungeons & Dragons is still the best-known example of this. In the game, you and the other players, 4 or 5 is a typical number, each create a character, either by rolling dice or by assigning points to different statistics like strength, intelligence, charisma, and so forth. Often these characters will have abilities above and beyond the average human being, whether that's superb fighting ability, magical spells, or superpowers, depending on the genre of the world you're playing in. Then there is one person who is the Game Master, also known as the Dungeon Master, Storyteller, or some other terms, depending on the specific game. I'll be using the generic term Game Master, or GM for short. They control all of the other people in the world you interact with. You describe what you would like your character to do, and based on your description, the Game Master will tell you what you need to do to succeed. For most role-playing games, this is decided by the roll of the dice, compared against the relevant statistics. Whether you succeed or fail, the GM tells you what happens next, so you can decide what you would like to do on your next turn. Based on your decisions and dice rolls, together you, the other player characters, known collectively as the party, and the GM end up telling a story of what happens in this world. So, now that you know the basics of what a role-playing game is, if you didn't already, let's talk about the terms asked about in the original question and how they can be good or bad. First, let's talk about min-maxing. As I mentioned before, each character that is created has a few different statistics. This determines how good your character is at performing various tasks, most often as they relate to combat, as many RPGs have a heavy combat focus. Some games use some sort of random number generation, usually dice, to decide what those numbers will be. In that case, it's luck of the draw if you end up being super powerful, or an average person, or somewhere in between. I'd like to take a moment to share a personal memory of this system and how it can go terribly wrong. In middle school, I played with a group, and one person was nearly always the GM. Looking back now, he was a bad game master for a number of reasons. Here's one example that's related to our current subject. One session, he had each of us declare what class we wanted to play before making our character. I chose Cleric, a healer class that casts spells. Then he had us roll our stats, going straight in order, instead of choosing which statistic each result went to, the usual way character creation was done. So I rolled, and ended up with a Cleric whose Wisdom, the stat that is most important for that class, was a 3. The absolute lowest number possible in this system. That game was absolutely miserable for me, as I couldn't do the things that made my class different from the others. That character, like so many others under this DM, died that first session. In order to make things more balanced, most games I see these days have some sort of point system, where every player has the same number of points to spend on making various stats better. If you spend those points evenly, you wind up with someone who is basically average. But more often, people will focus on one or two stats to the detriment of others. This makes you more specialized. Often the different party members will each focus in a different area, so you have a well-rounded, balanced party. This is a form of min-maxing. You are minimizing your skills in one area to maximize your skills elsewhere. And this is good, because it allows characters to be different from each other, so that each gets their moment to shine and show off their special expertise. This can be taken to an extreme, however. In some game systems, you have the ability to take flaws, such as an allergy or a fear, in turn for getting more points to improve your character's abilities. Some players have been known to work that system, and find certain combinations of flaws and abilities that make their characters extremely overpowered when compared to the rest of the party. This abuse is what most people think of as real min-maxing, and it's one of the negative stereotypes in the gaming world. In my experience, most people are opposed to this level of min-maxing unless they are themselves min-maxers. The other term that was used in this week's question was metagaming. In a role-playing game, there's always going to be a difference between what your character knows and what you as a player know. To start with, you know you're playing a game, and unless you're doing some really weird things with fourth wall breaking, see episode 8, your character does not. We refer to these as character knowledge versus player knowledge. When you metagame, you use player knowledge to influence your character's decision, even if it contradicts how your character might react given only character knowledge. As an example, if you've been playing D&D for a while, you're going to know many of the monster's vulnerabilities and resistances, like skeletons taking more damage from blunt weapons compared to slashing weapons. However, if your character has never run across a skeleton before, they might not have that knowledge. So, if you tell the GM that your character pulls out a club when he or she always attacks with a sword, and you don't have a legitimate reason as to why your character would know to do this, that is metagaming. More extreme examples include trying to use scientific knowledge, like chemistry and physics, that your character wouldn't have access to, or even going so far as to buy a copy of a pre-published adventure your GM is running and reading it beforehand in order to plan ahead. Metagaming will often pull you, as well as the other players, out of the story, since it makes you think less about how your character would naturally react to the situation. It also tends to make players less creative, as they simply think in terms of the characters and monsters' stats, instead of them being living, breathing things in the world that they are helping the game master create. For the most part, metagaming is something I frown upon in the games I run. However, to turn this on its head, there are some times that metagaming helps streamline things and gets everyone back into the story more quickly. For instance, when a new character joins the party. In quote-unquote real life, if a group of adventurers runs into someone they've never met inside a dungeon who claims to be there to help, many members of the party would be rightfully distrusting, keeping a close eye on the new character and possibly even turning down their offer of help entirely. But since the players all know that the new person is one of the other players in the party, they instead welcome them with open arms. At least usually. There are other examples I can think of where metagaming helps things along, such as recognizing and following a plot thread or hint. But these are really the exception rather than the rule. And as much as possible, you want to try to forget that you're in a game, and get swept up in the story that you and your friends are working together to create. So, that's my take on min-maxing and metagaming. The two are often talked about together, as min-maxing can be an example of metagaming, using knowledge of what the adventure will entail in order to help choose what your character will be good at. As I said in the beginning, all things in moderation, as there are instances when both of these things can make things more fun for the group as a whole, but if you take them too far, it can ruin the whole point of the game. If I ended here, this would be the shortest episode of Welcome to Geektown so far, but I don't think I have time to answer another full question without making this episode extra long. I received a suggestion from Bill D that I will be using to fill out episodes like this that are a little on the short side. He asked if I could explain some of the big catchphrases from science fiction, fantasy, and comics and where they originate. I think that's a great idea, Bill. Sometimes you'll hear a phrase and have no idea that it's even a reference to something else. I'm going to start this off with the phrase that opens every episode. Open the podcast bay doors, Hal. I came up with this homage when I was first discussing this podcast with a good friend of mine. Recently, that friend reminded me that some of my audience may not know what it is I'm paying tribute to each episode. In the classic Stanley Kubrick film, 2001: A Space Odyssey, based on the novel by Arthur C. Clarke, one of the main characters, Dave, is outside the space station in his smaller capsule, and requests that the computer that runs the station, named Hal, to open the pod bay doors. Hal does not acknowledge him for some time, but eventually does, leading to the following exchange.
Open the pod bay doors, Hal.
I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that.
Both "Open the pod bay doors, Hal" and "I'm sorry, Dave. I'm afraid I can't do that" have since entered the pop culture lexicon. If you don't believe me, try asking your smartphone to open the pod bay doors and see what it says. As to why Hal can't do that and what happens next is something I don't want to spoil for you if you've never seen the film. It's a brilliant and gorgeous movie, so I highly recommend sitting down and watching it the next time you have 2.5 hours free. Thankfully, in my world, Hal is much friendlier and happily opens the podcast bay doors every time. But it's about time to close those podcast bay doors. Before we do, Let me know if there's another catchphrase you've heard from your friends but never knew where it came from. Or ask me a new question about role-playing or sci-fi, fantasy, comics, or the other subjects I enjoy. You can send me an email at welcometogeektown@gmail.com or leave a comment directly on the show notes at www.welcome2geektown.com. Other contact options include facebook.com/welcometogeektown or Twitter @geektownpodcast. In the meantime, don't forget to subscribe and give me a 5-star review over on iTunes to join the Geektown City Council so you can help other people find the show and we can all tell them, "Welcome to Geektown, population, us." Welcome to Geektown is written, narrated, edited, and produced by me, Kurt Onstead. Theme music is by Aaron Levitz, logo art by Archie Santana. All other sound clips are the copyrighted material of their respective owners, and no infringement is intended, falling under fair use.